Hi, it is your friend Mike Bevel again with Footnotes. We're reading Middlemarch. We're making our way slowly through it. I will admit to trying to do this yesterday, and just let's talk. Okay, if you look in, if you're reading along, or if you have a copy of Middlemarch handy, just take a look at chapter 15. And it is one of the things that I think scares off a lot of, do I want to say contemporary? Modern readers from the Victorian novel, because what you are going to see are just walls of paragraphs. And something, having not lived in the 19th century, only living in the 20th and the 21st, paragraph breaks tend to sort of, it gives you a moment's rest, and that's like you can finish at the end of that paragraph, and that's sort of a nice way to know where you've stopped reading. But when you have page-long paragraphs, or paragraphs that are 2 pages long, or 3, or however many pages, I'm sure someone has written a novel that is one entire paragraph, and I'm sure I will not read that novel. But I probably will read that novel. I don't know why I said that. I think I was trying to sound tough to you. I was trying to, anyway. So let's just, that's just it's a difference in writing style. And I mean, it's cliche, but I think there's some truth to it, that people just had different, they used time differently. And so they wouldn't have minded so much wading through paragraphs in the way that we might mind wading through paragraphs. I'm going to bring this mic a little bit closer just in case that helps. So chapter 15 opens with a poem. I don't know if it matches the chapter or not, but let's read it anyway. Black eyes you have left, you say, blue eyes fail to draw you, yet you seem more rapt today than of old we saw you. No, Mike, that's not right. Let's try that again, and let's read it the way that it's written, and not just like you're just sort of forming the words. Take 2. Black eyes you have left, you say, and blue eyes fail to draw you. Yet you seem more rapt today than of old we saw you. Oh, I track the fairest fair, through new haunts of pleasure. Footprints here and echoes there guide me to my treasure. Lo, she turns, immortal youth wrought to mortal stature, fresh as starlight's aged truth, many-named nature. Well, I don't know. Let's see if I remember it, and if it occurs to us by the end of the chapter. Let's make everything just sort of easier to handle. No, I do not have COVID. I just have a cough sometimes. A great historian, as he insisted on calling himself, who had the happiness to be dead 120 years ago, and to take his place among the colossi whose huge legs our living pettiness is observed to walk under. And that's a Julius Caesar reference. It's part of a speech that Cassius gives to Brutus when they're talking about sort of the positioning that Caesar has started taking, and Cassius sort of saying, I don't see what he has that we don't have. We're not here to talk about Julius Caesar. We're reading Middlemarch, but I do think it's a really interesting question that we probably should figure out the answer to. Like, what is the need of hierarchies? Why is any one person, I don't know. I think, when I think about the current president and, I just, a second term of him seems really difficult to go through physically and emotionally. And I don't know that maybe a president was the wisest idea. Even with term, God, no, we're not doing this right now. We're reading Middlemarch. Hi, this is not a political podcast, and I have no business fulminating on any of it. But I just wanted to point out that neat little passage, that nod to Shakespeare that Eliot throws in, that a reader of that time would catch, because in the 19th century, maybe even up through part of the early 20th century, you would know your Bible and you would know your Shakespeare, because those would probably be two of the few books that you would have in your home. And you would also, learn these speeches in school. And so take his place among the colossi whose huge legs our living pettiness is observed to walk under, glories in his copious remarks and digressions is the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in all the lusty ease of his fine English. I was saying recently, sorry, me again, I'm reading a biography of Richard Dadd, who is a Victorian artist in the 1840s. Went mad, we will say, even though I think we're not supposed to, but I'm mentally ill and I get to use the word. Do I? I don't know. Maybe I don't. Something to think about. Something for us all to think about. Tell me what you think about it. Anyway, he goes spectacularly mad, kills his father, tries to kill another person on, I think, a boat or that he is on to France. And he is hoping to assassinate the Pope. And some people attributed it to sunstroke, and some people attributed it to any number of things. We need to be careful with schizophrenia, because what schizophrenia means today is not what it necessarily meant in the 19th century. We're not talking about Richard Dadd either, Mike. We're talking about Middlemarch. One of the things we have to go back to the Richard Dadd biography for a second. One of the things that I really like about it is it kind of feels kind of bitchy and conversational. And if the guy who wrote it is straight, bless his heart. And, thank you for recognizing what makes a compelling biography, because I don't know that I would be getting as much pleasure out of it as I am getting out of this book. And I really wish biography went back to who did Francis Stigmuller and his biographical writing of Flaubert. Amazing and very personal and very, and again, conversational. And then we sort of moved to, I'm getting off track again, and I'm going to keep going on this one just for a little bit longer. We have this idea that history is true. And we have this idea that history needs to be written. We need to get all the details in there to show that we did the homework. Like we earn our bona fides to write about Charles Dickens or Henry James or George Eliot. But history is more akin to fiction than I think we're ready to talk about, because it's a story being told to you by someone else. So like it's literally a construct in that history books or history accounts like that are sort of pulled together and put into book form. So I just think drop the facade of trying to seem unbiased or anything, and sort of, write excitedly about the person that you're writing about is what I would hope you would do in a biography. Yeah. And this chapter is super long, and I am going to go back to it now. Glories in his copious remarks and digressions as the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in all the lusty ease of his fine English. But Fielding lived when the days were longer, for time, like money, is measured by our needs. When summer afternoons were spacious and the clock ticked slowly in the winter evenings, we belated historians must not linger after his example. And if we did not, and if we did so, it is probable that our chat would be thin and eager, as if delivered from a camp stool in a parrot house. I, at least, have so much to do in unraveling certain human lots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven, that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. Okay, this is a completely Middlemarch and reading related diversion. So there's some interesting language here, and this whole chapter is going to be told from the I perspective. And the I perspective could be the narrator, or it could be George Eliot. And one of the things I would tell you as a reader is you do the book and you do the author a little bit of a disservice if you go into it knowing the full biography of the author and then sort of playing a Where's Waldo in the book, like, oh, I know where that scene came from, or I know what that who that character is based on. Because in a sense, it takes away from the creativity of the writer, and it just can lead you to answers that maybe not are true. Like they fit that parameter, but maybe in the scheme of things, they don't. And the 19th century is certainly not without experimental fiction, fiction that is pushing the boundaries of, what the novel can do. And, every generation does something usually terrible to the novel. But, the novel as a form is growing. I think I said in a past episode of this that I think video games are becoming a form of novel or a form of storytelling. So one of the things that I think we get to think about is, who is the I in this sentence? Is I George Eliot? And we're sort of getting a tale from George Eliot. Or is the I a narrator? And I think those are two different things. And again, you can support either. You can probably support both too if you wanted to, but you just have to be able to support the continued reading. For instance, the big mistake I made, some friends and I were reading The Portrait of a Lady, which was a reread for me. And, I was leading a discussion and I was telling them, pay attention to Ralph and and pay attention to the narrator. And I don't want to spoil the portrait of a lady, so I'm going to in that anecdote weirdly. It's one of my best. And just say, there are mistakes that you can make when you do that kind of stuff. But who is the I? And then you can sort of judge how reliable that I is. Like the 19th century, again, does not play with unreliable narrators as much as we'll see in the 20th century and certainly the 21st century. There are some novels that have it. I would say Villette by Charlotte Bronte has something of an unreliable narrator, or at least she's going to hold back information from you until you need to know it. And it may be something that that she's held on to for a while. But yeah, who is the I? Just something to think about sometimes when you're reading the book that has a third person narrator. I don't think I care much for, or I'm sort of tired of, or I think it's not good writing to write first person stuff all the time, because with first person stuff, it's really easy. You just have to understand one psychology. Whereas if you are writing in the third person and creating a world, you have to know everyone's psychology. So I don't know, maybe that's whatever form of classis that is. Let's keep going. For the love of Pete. Let's see. At present, I have to make the new settler Lydgate better known to anyone interested in him than he could possibly be, even to those who had seen the most of him since his arrival in Middlemarch. For surely all must admit that a man may be puffed and belauded, envied, ridiculed, counted upon as a tool, and fallen in love with, or at least selected as a future husband, and yet remain virtually unknown. That's sort of that's Jane Austen's opening to Pride and Prejudice. If somebody said, "Do it in the least economical way." And yet remain virtually unknown, known merely as a cluster of signs for his neighbors' false suppositions. There was a general impression, however, that Lydgate was not altogether a common country doctor, and in Middlemarch at that time, such an impression was significant of great things being expected from him. For everybody's family doctor was remarkably clever and was understood to have immeasurable skill in the management and training of the most skittish or vicious disease. The evidence of his cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patience's immovable conviction, and was unassailable by any objection except that their intuitions were opposed by others equally strong. Each lady who saw medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment regarding, each lady who saw the medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment regarding who saw, wow, why am I not able to read that sentence? And weirdly enough, well, I think I told you, I tried doing this yesterday. I think I got stuck in this same place. So let's learn to read with Mike Bevel. The evidence of his cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patience's immovable conviction, and was unassailable by any objection, except that their intuitions were opposed by others equally strong. Each lady who saw medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment regarding Toller and the lowering system as medical perdition. Yeah, I don't understand this sentence. I don't know how to read it. I don't understand its cadence or rhythm. And it's not even really a full sentence. It's it's a clause separated from the other part of the sentence by a semicolon. Let's try it one more time, and then I will stop because we didn't come here for this. The evidence of his cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patience's immovable conviction, and was unassailable by any objection, except that their intuitions were opposed to others equally strong. Each lady who saw medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment regarding Toller and the lowering system as medical perdition. Still don't understand how that sentence should be read. If you know, tell me. We're going to keep going, though. If I can find my way. For the heroic times of copious bleeding and blistering had not yet departed, still less the times of thoroughgoing theory, when disease in general was called by some bad name and treated accordingly without shilly-shally, as if, for example, it were to be called insurrection, which must not be fired on with blank cartridge, but have its blood drawn at once. The strengtheners and the lowerers were all clever men in somebody's opinion, which is really as much as can be said for any living talents. Nobody's imagination had gone so far as to conjecture that Mr. Lydgate could know as much as Dr. Sprague and Dr. Minchin, the two physicians who alone could offer any hope when danger was extreme and when the smallest when the smallest hope was worth a guinea. Still, I repeat, there was a general impression that Lydgate was something rather more uncommon than any general practitioner in Middlemarch. And this was true. He was but 27, an age at which many men are not quite common, at which they are hopeful of achievement, resolute in avoidance, thinking that mammon shall never put a bit in their mouths and get astride their backs, but rather that mammon, if they have anything to do with him, shall draw their chariot. Just for those who did not grow up in a Christian household, or in sort of that, I don't like Judeo-Christian because it's trying to shove together two things that don't necessarily, they don't belong together. They do belong together, by the way. Christianity relies on Judaism a lot, but Judaism has nothing whatsoever to do with the Christian Bible. So, where was I going with that? Oh, so mammon is sort of the demonic presence of greed. So actually riches and material wealth, but also with like a shade of greed to it, I would say. And mammon, I think one of the passages in the Gospels is one cannot serve God and mammon, or I think modern translators might say God and, wealth. And yet we have prosperity gospel people. I don't understand it either. Sell all your things, Christ said. He had been left an orphan when he was fresh from a public school. Public school in this case is not like our public school. Public school in England means private school because they're crazy, the English. They're nutty. They put U's everywhere. They say Z. Well, this is an English book, and I should probably be kinder to other white people who are having a tough time right now. Kidding. We'll be fine. He had been left an orphan when he was fresh from a public school. His father, a military man, had made but little provision for 3 children. And when the boy Tertius asked to have a medical education, it seemed easier to his guardians to grant his request by apprenticing him to a country practitioner than to make any objections on the score of family dignity. Being a doctor was not the status that it is now. And I wonder if being a doctor now has the same status that it did like in the 80s, where you hear these doctors making wild salaries, but they're making wild salaries on college programs that cost 2 bits and a bread wrapper, and medical students now are thousands in debt before they even get to start practicing medicine. And then it's just all, oh, the system is not, maybe we need to rethink the whole thing. But not in Middlemarch. Let's get back to Middlemarch. He was one of the rarer lads who early got a decided bent and make up their minds that there is something particular in life which they would like to do for its own sake, and not because their fathers did it. Most of us who turn to any subject with love remember some morning or evening hour when we got on a high stool to reach down in an untried volume, or sat with parted lips listening to a new talker. For very lack of books, began to listen to the voices within as the first traceable beginning of our love. That's a lovely passage. I don't think I read it well, but I think that's a lovely, yes, I was me as a kid. Give me a book and a place to be completely happy, completely content. And I hope, I don't want to be one of those old people that says, kids these days and their screens. I hope that time for them has the same value that books have for me. So maybe that's okay. So rather than just wishing they all read books, I hope that time that you spend doing whatever it is you're doing on whatever platform it is you're on, is, something that you look back on fondly and think to yourself, yeah, I really loved that day that I just sat and did that. Like one of my favorite reading experiences of all time is as a child, reading Watership Down with a cup of cocoa in front of our, what's this weird electric furnace thing. It was safe. It was the 80s. Who cared? But yeah, that is indelibly imprinted in my brain. I can remember everything about it. The heat from the radiator thing, the way the pages smelled, the feel of the book itself, and the cocoa and the laying on the floor. By the way, I cannot lay on the floor to read anymore. That's a young person's game. But the whole point of this is to say it's a beautiful passage about Nuri, and I hope people find it in their life in some way. Most of us who turn to any subject with love remember, did I already read that? Let me try that because I didn't read it well. And fuck it, this is my channel. Most of us who turn to any subject with love remember some morning or evening hour when we got on a high stool to reach down an untried volume, or sat with parted lips listening to a new talker, or for very lack of books began to listen to the voices within as a first traceable beginning of our love. Something of that sort happened to Lydgate. He was a quick fellow, and when hot from play would toss himself in a corner and in 5 minutes be deep in any sort of book that he could lay his hands on. If it were Rassilay, maybe I said that right, or Gulliver, so much the better, but Bailey's dictionary would do, or the Bible with the Apocrypha in it. Something he must read when he was not riding the pony or running and hunting or listening to the talk of men. All this was true of him at 10 years of age. He had then read through Kreisel, or The Adventures of a Guinea, which was neither milk for babes nor any chalky mixture meant to pass for milk, and it had already occurred to him that books were stuff and that life was stupid. Books were stuff and life was stupid. His school studies had not much modified that opinion, for though he did his classes, his classics and mathematics, he was not preeminent in them. It was, of course, it was said of him that Lydgate could do anything he liked, but he had certainly not yet liked to do anything remarkable. He was a vigorous animal with a ready understanding, but no spark had yet kindled in him an intellectual passion. Knowledge seemed to him a very superficial affair, easily mastered. Judging from the conversation of his elders, he had apparently got already more than was necessary for mature life. Perhaps this was not an exceptional result of expensive teaching at that period of short-waisted coats and other fashions which have not yet recurred. But one vacation, a wet day sent him to the small home library to hunt once more for a book which might have some freshness for him. In vain. Unless, indeed, he took down a dusty row of volumes with gray paper backs and dingy labels, the volumes of an old cyclopedia which he had never disturbed. It would at least be a novelty to disturb them. They were on the highest shelf. It would be, and he stood on a chair to get them down. But he opened the volume which he first took from the shelf. How someone, But he opened the volume which he first took from the shelf. Somehow one is apt to read in a makeshift attitude, just where it might seem inconvenient to do so. How many of you have stood in a bookstore reading a book because all the chairs were taken by sociopaths bent on keeping you from your best life? The page he opened on was under the heading of anatomy. And the first passage that drew his eye was on the valves of the heart. He was not much acquainted with valves of any sort, but he knew that valvae were folding doors, and through this crevice came a sudden light, startling him with his first vivid notion of finely adjusted mechanism in the human frame. A liberal education had, of course, left him free to read the indecent passages in the school classics, but beyond general sense of secrecy and obscenity in connection with his internal structure, had left his imagination quite unbiased, so that for anything he knew, his brains lay in small bags at his temples, and he had no more thought of representing to himself how his blood circulated than how paper served instead of gold. But the moment of vocation had come, and before he got down from his chair, the world was made new to him by a presentiment of endless processes, filling the vast spaces planked out of his sight by that wordy ignorance which he had supposed to be knowledge. From that hour, Lydgate felt the growth of an intellectual passion. We are not afraid of telling over and over again how a man comes to fall in love with a woman and be wedded to her, or else be fatally parted from her. Is it due to excessive poetry or of stupidity that we never weary of describing what King James called a woman's makedom and her fairness? Never weary of listening to the twanging of the old troubadour strings, and are comparatively uninterested in that other kind of makedom and fairness, which must be wooed with industrious thoughts and patient renunciation of small desires. In ours, sorry, in the story of this passion, too, the development varies. Sometimes it is the glorious marriage, sometimes frustration and final parting, and not seldom the catastrophe is bound up with the other passion, sung by the troubadours. For in the multitude of middle-aged men who go about their vocations in a daily course determined for them much in the same way as the tie of their cravats, there is always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. In a daily course determined for them. I think that is an interesting insight that Eliot has into sort of both the like one of the dangers of capitalism and one of the dangers of patriarchy, because patriarchy is interested in orthodoxy and power, and capitalism works best if you've got people who think that way. And she's noticing that this male idea of freedom is an illusion for many men. They are not granted that same sort of permission that their higher ups do. And again, I go back to why hierarchies. I'm still trying to think about like what is money and what, and again, what is above money? We know what's above money, but I'm still sort of fascinated by the idea that there is this thing other than money that's out there. Why don't you keep reading, Mike? Because we are, yeah, do a lot more wiggling. That's what people came here for. They did not come here for that. Oh, where did we leave off? And not seldom the catastrophe is bound up with the other passion sung by the troubadours. For in the multitude of middle-aged men who go about their vocations in a daily course determined for them, much in the same way as the tie of their cravats, there is always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. The story of the, sorry, one more thing. I mean, that there's a little bit there that echoes the prelude, like, you know, many a Dorothea has been born. And many of these men had hoped to do Saint Teresa-esque things, and not all of them got the chance to. Well done, George Eliot. You're a good writer. Once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. The story of their coming to be shapen after the average and fit to be packed by the gross is hardly ever told, even in their consciousness. For perhaps their ardor in generous unpaid toil for perhaps their ardor in generous unpaid toil cooled as imperceptibly as the ardor of their youthful loves, till one day their earlier self walked like a ghost in its old home and made the new furniture ghastly. Nothing in the world more subtle than the process of their gradual change. In the beginning, they inhaled it knowingly. You and I may have sent some of our breath towards infecting them when we uttered our conforming falsities or drew our silly conclusions. Or perhaps it came with the vibrations from a woman's glance. holy mackerel, guys, not guys, group, friends, trying to watch how I gender my language. Um, that's an extraordinary paragraph. Um, Actually, I'm gonna do a little bit of this action because I want to come back and read that again. And we're still, like I said, in the part of the book that I have already read. Like, we're not into new territory yet for me. We're still within where I haven't failed. But I think what we just discovered together is my lack of attention in reading in all those times, because that passage has never jumped out to me before in this way. I think it's something to do with the reading one chapter at a time and really getting to think about it. I think something about speaking it, like speak the word, and it sort of magically stays in your head. Anyway, we're not even close to done with this chapter, by the way. Lydgate did not mean to be one of those failures, and there was the better hope of him because his scientific interest soon took the form of a professional enthusiasm. He had a youthful belief in his breadwinning work, not to be stifled by that imitation and makeshift called his prentice days. And he carried to his studies in London, Edinburgh, and Paris the conviction that the medical profession, as it might be, was the finest in the world, presenting the most perfect interchange between science and art, offering the most direct alliance between intellectual conquest and the social good. Lydgate's nature demanded his combination. He was an emotional creature with a flesh and blood sense of fellowship which withstood all the abstractions of special study. He cared not only for cases, but for John and Elizabeth, especially Elizabeth. Who are John and Elizabeth? Is that biblical? Norton's no help. I don't think we met anybody named John and Elizabeth. Okay, so that's kind of embarrassing. After I just praised myself for catching something, here I am losing something. John and Elizabeth, is the parents of Mary? I don't know. There was another attraction at his profession. It wanted reform and gave a man an opportunity for some indignant resolve to reject its venal decorations and other humbug, and to be the possessor of genuine, though undemanded qualifications. He went to study in Paris with the determination that when he came home again, he would settle in some provincial town as a general practitioner and resist the irrational severance between medical and surgical knowledge in the interest of his own scientific pursuits, as well as of the general advance. He would keep away from the range of London intrigues, jealousies, and social truckling, and win celebrity, however slowly, as Jenner had done, by the independent value of his work. Edward Jenner, physician. Done by the independent, for it must be remembered that this was a dark period, and in spite of venerable colleges, which used great efforts to secure purity of knowledge by making it scarce. Oh. For it must be remembered that this was a dark period, and in spite of his work, and in spite of venerable colleges, which used great efforts to secure purity of knowledge by making it scarce, and to exclude error by a rigid exclusiveness in relation to fees and appointments, it happened that very ignorant young gentlemen were promoted in town, and many more got a legal right to practice over large areas in the country. Also, The high standard held up to the public mind by the College of Physicians, which gave its peculiar sanction to the expensive and highly ratified medical medical instructions obtained by graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, did not hinder quackery from having an excellent time of it. For since professional practice chiefly consisted in giving a great many drugs, the public inferred that it might be better off with more drugs still, if they could only be got cheaply, and hence swallowed large cubic measures of physic described by unscrupulous ignorance which had taken no degrees. Considering that statistics had not yet embraced a calculation as to the number of ignorant or canting doctors, which absolutely must exist in the teeth of all changes, it seemed to Lydgate that a change in the units was the most direct mode of changing the numbers. He meant to be a unit who would make a certain amount of difference towards that spreading change which would one day tell appreciably upon the averages, and in the meantime have the pleasure of making an advantageous difference to the viscera of his own patients. That he did not simply aim at a more genuine kind of practice than was common. He was ambitious of a wider effect. He was fired with the possibility that he might work out the proof of an anatomical conception and make a link in the chain of discovery. Does it seem incongruous to you that a Middlemarch surgeon should dream of himself as a discoverer? Most of us indeed know little of the great originators until they have been lifted up among the constellations and already rule our fates. But that Herschel, for example, who broke the barriers of the heavens, did he not once play a provincial church organ and give music lessons to stumbling pianists? Famous German-born English astronomer who began his career as a teacher of music. Thank you, Norton. Each of those shining ones had to walk on the earth among neighbors who perhaps thought much more of his gait and his garments than of anything which was to give him a title to everlasting fame. Each of them had his little local personal history sprinkled with small temptations and sordid cares, which made the retarding friction of his course towards finding companionship with the immortals. Towards final companionship with the immortals. Lydgate was not blind to the dangers of such frictions, but he had plenty of confidence in his resolution to avoid it as far as possible. Being 27, he felt himself experienced, and he was not going to have his vanities provoked by contact with the showy, worldly success of the capital, but to live among people who could hold no rivalry with that pursuit of great idea, which was to be a twin object with the assiduous practice of his profession. There was fascination in the hope that the two purposes would illuminate each other. The careful observation and inference, which was his daily work, the use of the lens to further his judgment in special cases, would further his thought as an instrument of larger inquiry. Was not this the typical preeminence of his profession? He would be a good Middlemarch doctor, and by that very means keep himself in the track of far-reaching investigation. On one point, he may fairly claim approval at this particular stage of his career. He did not mean to imitate those philanthropic models who make a profit out of poisonous pickles to support themselves while they are exposing. Let's try that all again. I lost track of everything. Was not this the typical preeminence of his profession? He would be a good Middlemarcher doc. Oh. Were you all hoping I would get better at sight reading the more I did it? I sure was. Was not this the typical preeminence of his profession? He would be a good Middlemarch doctor, and by that very means keep himself in the track of far-reaching investigation. On one point, he may fairly claim approval at this particular stage of his career. He did not mean to imitate those philanthropic models who make a profit out of poisonous pickles to support themselves while they are exposing adulteration or hold shares in a gambling hell that they may have leisure to represent the cause of public morality. Get it, George. He intended to begin in his own case some particular reforms which were quite certainly within his reach and much less of a problem than the demonstrating of an anatomical conception. One of these reforms was to act stoutly on the strength of recent legal decision and simply prescribe without dispensing drugs or taking percentages from the druggists. So what we're seeing here is the beginning of a system where, so it used to be the doctor would also be the one, like you would pay the doctor for the service, but you would also buy the medication from the doctor, which would encourage doctors to sell. Anyway, so they decided to separate that. Doctors will doctor, pharmacists will farmers. And so, but that's just what we're seeing. And it's just sort of interesting that something we take for granted now was not the same way. Zach and I play a game when we used to. We'll never leave the house again. When we used to go on car trips, we would play this game called The Future, where we would try to think about things that we're doing today that in 100 years, people will look back and say, holy smacks, why did they think chemotherapy? You know, the way we look back at the way certain venereal diseases were treated with mercury that actually made people mad and dead. Why did I stop? Oh, the reform, right. This was an innovation for one who had chosen to adopt this style of general practitioner in a country town, and he would be felt as offensive. So let's do that again. This was an innovation for one who had chosen to adopt the style of general practitioner in a country town, and would be felt as offensive criticism by his professional brethren. But Lydgate meant to be innovative in his treatment also, and he was wise enough to see that the best security for his practicing honestly, according to his belief, was to get rid of systemic temptations to the contrary. Perhaps that was a more cheerful time for observers and theorizers than the present. We are apt to think it the finest era of the world, when America was beginning to be discovered, when a bold sailor, even if he were wrecked, might alight on a new kingdom. And about 1829, the dark territories of pathology were a fine America for a spirited young adventurer. I like the personification of pathology as America. I hear what you're doing there, George. I call her George. Did we talk about the fact that her name is Marianne Evans and she took the name George Eliot? She took the name George because her partner, they could never marry, was George Henry Lewis. And I think the Eliot just because she liked it. I don't think there's anything to that, but that's how George Eliot came to be. And part of it is it was easier. It's weird because there's this received wisdom among Victorianists about the difficulty it was for women to get published, and which is why the Bronte sisters published under male names and why maybe George Eliot did. And some of that is true earlier in the century, but there are a lot of novels by ladies, like so many novels by ladies that George Eliot herself writes an essay called Silly Novels by Lady Novelists. So I think it's less that women couldn't get published, but that women wanted their work to be taken seriously or to be read in a different way. And so they used a male pseudonym. Perhaps that was a more cheerful time. We've got that far, didn't we? Lydgate was ambitious above all to contribute towards enlarging the scientific rational basis of his profession. The more he became interested in special questions of disease, such as the nature of fever or fevers, the more keenly he felt the need for that fundamental knowledge of structure, which just at the beginning of the century, had been illuminated by the brief inglorious career of Bichat. Marie-François Xavier Bichat, French anatomist and physiologist. Anatomist. So just a fun 19th century fact is medical schools worked on cadavers, and they generally worked on the cadavers of the executed, whether they were hanged or beheaded. The bodies could still be cut into. And there was this, and then you had some enterprising people who thought, well, I mean, what if we just dug up recently buried bodies and brought them? Like, we would put the ground back. Who's going to know? Was sort of the thinking. And so there's a lot of grave robbery. And then Burke and Hare, B-U-R-K-E and H-A-R-E, Google them. They took it a step further and thought, let's get rid of the middleman and just kill people and take them and sell them to medical schools. And that didn't go well for them, ironically. And the other thing that I wanted to say about anatomists is toward the end of the century, so around when this book is published, England passes, I think, its first anti-vivisection act. And vivisection is cutting open alive animals. It was considered cruel and terrible. There's a Wilkie Collins novel that is incredibly problematic for a 21st century reader who wants the past to be like the present. If you're okay with the past being the past and recognizing that, people did good and people did bad, just like people are going to look at us and say, some people wore masks and some people did not. I think it's generally going to be the offspring of the people who wore masks who will be making that observation. The virus just has a way of taking care of that. Remember that guy? Anyway, Wilkie Collins has a book called Heart and Science. It has a mad vivisectionist in it, and there's a gorilla involved at some point, and I think there's also like a psychopathic little person. Like, again, it is yes, I mean, it's all those things. It's a hell of a read, and that is not necessarily a great argument, but I'm just saying, it's a book that exists in the world. If you like Wilkie Collins, or if you like weird stories, Heart and Science is all about vivisection and sort of what, actually, interestingly, Collins asks the question, should we? Like, we know we can, but should? And I don't know that we ask that question enough when we're making things. Anyway, all this because I said by the brief and glorious career of Bichat, who died when he was only 31, but, like another Alexander, left a realm large enough for many heirs. That great Frenchman first carried out the conception that living bodies, fundamentally considered, are not associations of organs which can be understood by studying them first apart and then, as it were, federally, but must be regarded as consisting of certain primary webs of or tissues out of which the various organs, brain, heart, lungs, and so on, are compacted, as the various accommodations of a house are built up in various proportions of wood, iron, stone, brick, zinc, and the rest, each material having its peculiar composition, structure, or its parts. Nope. Each material having its peculiar composition and proportions. No man, one sees, can understand and estimate the entire structure or its parts, what are its frailties and what its repairs, without knowing the nature of the materials. And the conception wrought out by Bichat with his detailed study of the different tissues acted necessarily on medical questions as the turning of gaslight would act on a dim, oil-lit street, showing new connections and hitherto hidden facts of structure, which must be taken into account in considering the symptoms of maladies and the action of medicaments. Medicaments. Where would you buy medicaments? I probably didn't say that word right. My friend Judith once yelled at me for saying the word, what was the word? I emphasized the wrong syllable in the word, and exasperatedly she explained in a very Judith way, and I love her with all of my heart, that it isn't pronounced that way. And the word, when it comes to me, I'll just shout it out to you. Where did we leave off? Okay, yeah. Medicaments. But results which depend on human conscience and intelligence work slowly. And now at the end of 1829, most medical practice was still strutting or shambling along the paths. Yeah, she did say strutting. I would have said stuttering. I'm not a writer. Most medical practice was still strutting or shambling along the old paths, and there was still scientific work to be done, which might have seemed to be a direct sequence of Bichat's. This great seer did not go beyond the consideration of the tissue as ultimate facts in the living organism, marking the limit of anatomical analysis, but it was open to another mind to say, have not these structures some common basis from which they have all started, as our... Okay, now words are just being weird. From which they have all started, as your SARS net, gauze, net, satin, and velvet from the raw cocoon. Here would be another light as of oxyhydrogen, showing the very, can you imagine reading, like it's 1871, you bought Middlemarch, you take it home to read it, and the first book and the first couple chapters of the second book all are about people, and you're with people. And now, out of nowhere, she Michael Crichtons us with all this talk about, medical developments and science, and just like that. Just there should have been a warning on the book. You're going to get bored sometimes because there's going to be science in there. I told my husband I got bored with space. I don't understand the interest in space. There's too much of it. I will never know about it. Here we go. Here would be another light as of oxyhydrogen, showing the very grain of things and revising all former explanations. Of this sequence to Bichat's work, already vibrating along many currents of the European mind, Lydgate was enamored. He longed to demonstrate the more intimate relations of living structure and help to define men's thoughts more accurately after the true order. The work had not yet been done, but only prepared for those who knew how to use the preparations. What was the primitive tissue? In that way, Lydgate put the question, not quite in the way required by the awaiting answer. But such missing of the right word befalls many seekers, and he counted on quiet intervals to be watchfully seized for taking up the threads of investigation, on many hints to be won from diligent application, not only of the scalpel, but of the microscope, which research had begun to use again with new enthusiasm of reliance. Such was Lydgate's plan of his future, to do good small work for Middlemarch and great work for the world. He was certainly a happy fellow at this time to be 27, without any fixed vices, with a generous resolution that his action should be beneficent, and with ideas in his brain that made life interesting, quite apart from the cultus of horseflesh and the other mystic rites of costly observance, which the £800 left him after buying his practice would certainly not have gone far in paying for. He was at a starting point which makes many a man's career a fine subject for betting, if there were any gentlemen given to that amusement who could appreciate the complicated probabilities of an arduous purpose with all the possible thwartings and furtherings of circumstance, all the niceties of inward balance by which a man swims and makes his point, or else is carried headlong. That's a long sentence. The risk would remain even with close knowledge of Lydgate's character, for character too is a process and an unfolding. The man was still in the making, as much as the Middlemarch doctor an immortal discoverer, and there were both virtues and faults capable of shrinking or expanding. The faults will not, I hope, be a reason for the withdrawal of your interest in him. No, there are so many other reasons I'm not interested in Lydgate at this point, George. Among our valued friends, is there not some one or other who is a little too self-confident and disdainful? Don't you dare look at me. Whose distinguished mind is a little spotted with commonness, who is a little pinched here and protuberant there with the native prejudices, or whose better energies are liable to lapse down the wrong channel under the influence of transient solicitations. All these things might be alleged against Lydgate, but then they are the paraphrases of a polite preacher who talks of Adam and would not like to mention anything painful to the pew renters. The particular faults from which these delicate generalities are distilled have distinguishable physiognomies, diction, accent, and grimaces, filling up parts in very various dramas. Our vanities differ as our noses do. All conceit is not the same conceit, but varies in correspondence with the minutiae of mental make in which one of us differs from another. Lydgate's conceit was of the arrogant sort, never simpering, never impertinent, but massive in its claims and benevolently contemptuous. He would do a great deal for Lydgate's conceit was of the arrogant sort, never simpering, never impatient, but massive in its claims and benevolently contemptuous. He would do a great deal for noodles, being sorry for them, and feeling quite sure that they could have no power over him. I love noodles. My favorite food, noodles, prepared almost any way. I just love a pasta. Noodles and potatoes, I'm set. And you can see the results of a diet like that. You know what? You can email me later to talk about how I look so great and on a diet that is primarily carbohydrates and refined sugars. Oh, we're still going in this book. He would do a great deal for noodles, being sorry for them, and feeling quite sure that they could have no power over him. He had thought of joining the, I don't understand, what does that mean? He would do a great deal for noodles. It's a weird sentence. He would do a great deal for noodles, he would do a great deal for noodles, being sorry for them and feeling quite sure that they could have no power over him. He had thought of joining the Saint Simonians when he was in Paris. Oh, that you footnote. Saint Simon is French philosopher, founder of French positivism, socialism, and the new Christianity, which was intended to remake society. Christianity needs to maybe not do so much. Take a break, Christianity. You've earned it. I speak as a former Christian, current theist, and that's where that comes from. I can't get over these noodles. Joining the Saint Simonians when he was in Paris in order to turn them against some of their own doctrines. All his faults were marked by kindred traits in some of their own doctrines. My friend Steve once wrote me in an email, I hope all of my mistakes bend toward kindness. And it's a very profound and beautiful statement. All his faults were marked by kindred traits and were those of a man who had a fine baritone, whose clothes hung well upon him, and who even in his ordinary gestures had an air of inbred distinction. When they lay the spots, where then lay the spots of commonness? Says an air of inbred distinction. No, says let's try this again. Where then lay the spots of commonness, says a young lady enamored of that careless grace. How could there be any commonness in a man so well bred, so ambitious of social distinction, social distancing? How could there be any commonness in a man so well bred, so ambitious of social distinction, so generous and unusual in his views of social duty? As easily as there may be stupidity in a man of genius if you take him unawares on the wrong subject, or as many a man who has the best will to advance the social millennium might be ill-inspired in imagining its lighter pleasures, unable to go beyond Offenbach's music or the brilliant punning in the last. Okay, George, that is. Oh. We'll try it again. As easily as there may be stupidity in a man of genius if you take him unawares on the wrong subject, or as many a man who has the best will to advance the social millennium might be ill-inspired in imagining its lighter pleasures, unable to go beyond Offenbach's music or the brilliant punning in the last burlesque. Again, that is that's not a good sentence. I should not have to read a sentence twice to get it. I am not a dummy, and I read this literature a lot. So is George Eliot a good writer? Sometimes. Is she a great writer? Sometimes. But I think she is one of the best novelists. I think she understands her characters in ways that a lot of writers don't take the time to do. Um, Lydgate's spots of commonness lay in the complexion of his prejudices, which, in spite of noble intention and sympathy, were half of them such as are found in ordinary men of the world. The distinction of mind which belonged to his intellectual ardor did not penetrate his feeling and judgment about furniture or women, or the desirability of its being known without his telling, that he was better born than other country surgeons. He did not mean to think of furniture at present, but whenever he did so, it was to be feared that neither biology nor schemes of reform would lift him above the vulgarity of feeling that there would be an incompatibility in his furniture and not being of the best. I think furniture there is doing some heavy work. Lydgate sounds like the kind of guy that you would today just know that guy is bad news bears. I'm not going to date him. He's very, very himself. As to women, he had once already been drawn headlong by impetuous folly, which he meant to be final, since marriage at some distant period would of course not be impetuous. For those who want to be acquainted with Lydgate, it will be good to know what was the case of impetuous folly, for it may stand as an example of the fitful swerving of passion to which he was prone, together with the chivalrous kindness which helped to make him morally lovable. The story can be told without many words. It happened when he was studying in Paris, and just at that time, when, over and above his other work, he was occupied with some galvanic experiments. Uh, oh, this is early shock therapy. One evening, tired with his experimenting and not being able to elicit the facts he needed, he left his frogs and rabbits to some repose under their trying and mysterious dispensation of unexplainable shocks. Oh no. And went to finish his evening at the theater of the Porte Saint Martin, where there was a melodrama which he had already seen several times, attracted not by the ingenious work of the collaborating authors, but by an actress whose part it was to stab her lover, mistaking him for the evil designing duke of the piece. Lydgate was in love with this actress, as a man is in love with a woman whom he never expects to speak to. She was a Provençal with dark eyes, a Greek profile, and rounded, majestic form, having that sort of beauty which carries a sweet matronliness even in youth, and her voice was a soft cooing. She had but lately come to Paris and bore a virtuous reputation, but her husband, She had but lately come to Paris and bore a virtuous reputation, her husband acting with her as the unfortunate lover. It was her it was her acting which was no better than it should be, but the public was satisfied. Lydgate's only relaxation now was to go and look at this woman, just as he might have thrown himself under the breath of that sweet south wind on a bank of violets for a while, without prejudice to his galvanism, to which he would presently return. But this evening the old drama had a new catastrophe. At the moment when the heroine was to act the stabbing of her lover, and he was to fall gracefully, the wife veritably stabbed her husband, who fell as death willed. A wild shriek pierced the house, and the Provençal fell swooning. A shriek and a swoon were demanded by the play, but the swooning too was real this time. Lydgate leaped and climbed, he hardly knew how, onto the stage, and was active in help, making the acquaintance of his heroine by finding a contusion on her head and lifting her gently in his arms. Yeah, that's who you need to go after, is the lady Lydgate, and not the man bleeding out on the stage. Good call. Paris rang with the story of this death. Was it a murder? Some of the actress's warmest admirers were inclined to believe in her guilt and liked her the better for it. I would probably be one of those people because I am not well. Uh, Some of the actress's warmest admirers were inclined to believe in her guilt and liked her the better for it. Such was the taste of those times. But Lydgate was not one of these. He vehemently contended for her innocence, and the remote, impersonal passion for her beauty, which he had felt before, had passed now into personal devotion and tender thought of her lot. The notion of murder was absurd. No motive was discoverable, the young couple being understood to dote on each other. And it was not unprecedented that an accidental slip of the foot should have brought these grave consequences. The legal investigation ended in Madame Laur's release. Lydgate, by this time, had had many interviews with her and found her more and more adorable. She talked little, but that was an additional charm. Always to a man, that's a charm. She was melancholy and seemed grateful. Her presence was enough, like that of the evening light. Lydgate was madly anxious about her affection and jealous lest any other man than himself should win it and ask her to marry him. But instead of reopening her engagement at the Porte Saint Martin, where she would have been all the more popular for the fatal episode, she left Paris without warning, forsaking her little court of admirers. Perhaps no one carried inquiry far except Lydgate, who felt that all science had come to a standstill while he imagined the unhappy Laura, maybe it's Laura, Laure, how would you say that? Stricken by the ever wandering sorrow, herself wandering and finding no faithful comforter. Hidden actresses, however, are not so difficult to find as some other hidden facts, and it was not long before Lydgate gathered indications that Laura had taken the route to Lyons. He found her at last acting with a great success at Avignon under the same name, looking more majestic than ever as a forsaken wife, carrying her child in her arms. He spoke to her after the play, was received with the usual quietude which seemed to him beautiful as clear depths of water, and obtained leave to visit her the next day, when he was bent on telling her that he adored her and on asking her to marry him. He knew that this he knew that this was like sorry he knew that this was like the sudden impulse of a madman, incongruous even with his habitual foibles. No matter. It was the one thing which he was resolved to do. He had two selves within him, apparently, and they must learn to accommodate each other and bear reciprocal impediments. Strange that some of us with quick alternate vision see beyond our infatuations, and even while we rave on the heights, behold the wide plain where our persistent self pauses and awaits us. To have approached Lore, let's say Lore, with any suit that was not reverentially tender would have been simply a contradiction of his whole feeling towards her. You have come all the way from Paris to find me, she said to him the next day, sitting before him with folded arms and looking at him with eyes that seemed to wonder as an untamed, ruminating animal wonders. Are all Englishmen like this? I can't do a French accent, by the way. Are all Englishmen like this? Um, I came because I could not live without trying to see you. You are lonely. I love you. I want you to consent to be my wife. I will wait, but I want you to promise that you will marry me, no one else. Lorraine looked at him in silence with a melancholy radiance from under her grand eyelids until he was full of rapturous certainty and knelt close to her knees. I will tell you something, she said in her cooing way, keeping her arms folded. My foot really slipped. I know, said Lydgate deprecatingly. It was a fatal accident, a dreadful stroke of calamity that bound me to you the more. Again Lorray paused a little, and then said, slowly, I meant to do it. Lydgate, strong man as he was, turned pale and trembled. Moments seemed to pass before he rose and stood at a distance from her. There was a secret, then, he said at last, even vehemently. He was brutal to you. You hated him. No, he wearied me. He was too fond. He would live in Paris and not in my country. That was not agreeable to me. Great God, said Lydgate in a groan of horror. And you planned to murder him? We did not plan. It came to me in the play. I meant to do it. Lydgate stood mute and unconsciously pressed his hat on while he looked at her. He saw this woman, the first to whom he had given his young adoration amid the throng of stupid criminals. You are a good young man, she said, but I do not like husbands. I will never have another. 3 days afterwards, Lydgate was at his galvanism again in his Paris chambers, believing that illusions were at an end for him. He was saved from hardening effects by the abundant kindness of his heart and his belief that human life might be made better. But he had more reason than ever for trusting his judgment now that it was so experienced, and henceforth he would take a strictly scientific view of woman, entertaining no expectations but such as were justified beforehand. No one in Middlemarch was likely to have such a notion of Lydgate's past as has been faintly shadowed. No one in Middlemarch was likely to have such a notion of Lydgate's past as has here been faintly shadowed, and indeed the respectable townsfolk there were not more given than mortals generally to any eager attempt at exactness in the representation to themselves of what did not come under their own senses. Not only young virgins of that town, but gray-bearded men also were often in haste to conjecture how a new acquaintance might be wrought into their purposes, contented with the very vague knowledge as to the way in which life had been shaping him for that instrumentality. Middlemarch, in fact, counted on swallowing Lydgate and assimilating him very comfortably. And that's the end of chapter 15. I don't know what the poem had to do with anything. Parts of it I do really want to reread. Parts of it I don't want to reread ever again in my life. But that ending story is silly. And I love it. Like that could be its very own book. And Eliot actually has a history of this. Excuse me, Daniel Aranda, the final novel she wrote, was going to be 2 separate novels, one about a girl named Gwendolyn, one about a man named Daniel Deronda trying to find out what his heritage is. And it turns out Middlemarch, too, was sort of seen as 2 different stories. Eliot started it as 2 different stories, one being Dorothea's story, and then the other, I don't know if it would have been like Scenes of Clerical Life and only on Middlemarch, or anyway, they're Wikipedia it, because you're on the internet. Wow, okay, so we did it. We got through it. It was a lot of reading this time, and my throat hurts. So I am going to bid you goodbye. I hope you come back when I post one of these again. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'm Mike Bevel. This is Footnotes. We are on page 99 of Middlemarch. I think that's a pretty big deal.